Hi, class. Okay, so this is my third attempt at trying to do a final exam review. So I'm not going to beat around the bush this time. My baby has decided tonight that she does not want to sleep unless I am right next to her. And so I'm sorry if you started watching before and I had to keep leaving. Hopefully, we'll make it all the way through this time without having to leave. So, okay, things that you need to know for this test. You need to know reasons for studying public speaking. It is empowering. It is helpful for speaking at weddings, funerals, in business, all that kind of stuff. Read that part of the chapter. Ways to handle your speech anxiety. The number one way to handle your speech anxiety is to be prepared for your speech. Okay, be prepared for your speech and practice ahead of time. Eliminate distractions. Exercise the day of your speech if possible. Use clean, simple note cards. Make sure that you're confident in your visual aids. You can use breathing patterns. There's a lot of different options for being able to minimize your speech anxiety. Now, remember that on this test, they're asking you questions about the textbook. So you really need to look at what the textbook has to say. In my Zoom meeting that I did on speech anxiety, I did a lot of independent research to find out what researchers are actually saying about what eliminates or minimizes speech anxiety. So, to do a good job on the test, you need to be able to look at the textbook and see what the textbook has to say about minimizing your speech anxiety. You also need to understand the idea of audience adaptation. So, audience adaptation means that you, as you speak, you notice how your audience is responding and you see your audience feedback, and then you change your speech to match your audience's feedback. So, let's say that your audience is starting to zone out. You might want to cut forward a little bit to something really interesting in your speech or like a video or something like that, so you can try to get their attention back. I do that in class all the time. Um, if you explain something and you see that your audience looks totally lost, like every time that someone explains stuff in the Star Wars universe to me, then you might need to slow down. You might need to backtrack a little bit. You might need to give more context. That's all about audience adaptation. Okay, so you're basically changing as you go to be able to fit the needs of your audience. You additionally need to know about audience analysis. So, usually, when we think of audience analysis, we think of like age, race, gender, socioeconomic status, religious beliefs, political leanings, stuff like that. So, you really want to focus on what your audience is made up of. If you remember from my speech when I talked about going and talking at the car dealership, but I didn't ask enough questions ahead of time. I ended up having really bad speech anxiety because I was not prepared. I was going in expecting a bunch of college students. They ended up being a bunch of 50 to 70-year-old men who were all used car dealers. And it was a much different environment than I expected. And so I didn't do a very good job because I didn't know who my audience was going to be. So there are questionnaires that you can actually give out. And they have questions on them about how people feel about certain issues. And so you need to be able to understand that. It does ask a question, or at least it did when I went through the final exam. It asked me a question about what kinds of questions you would ask or what types of questions you might ask in advance. So you should understand that when you're understanding audience analysis. Okay. You also need to understand, and this is from the first 1 to 3 chapters of the textbook, you need to understand the ethics of public speaking. So, what does it mean to be an ethical public speaker? You need to also be able to understand types of plagiarism. So, there's global plagiarism, patchwork plagiarism, incremental plagiarism. What kind of plagiarism is someone using in their speech if they do this? That was the kind of question that was on there. Okay, so make sure that you understand the different types of plagiarism that are discussed in the textbook. Okay, You also need to understand how to evaluate sources. So, if you are using a magazine or a newspaper, then you need to be able to understand, okay, how do I decide whether or not this is a good source to use? And remember that we talked about the concept of authorship, sponsorship, and recency. So, is the person who wrote this piece someone who's informed on the topic, who's knowledgeable and has the appropriate background? Is the organization that's sponsoring this information very biased? Are they going to get something out of it if I join their page or follow this organization? And then, how recently was this piece written? Remember, we said that if it is a piece that's written about smartphones, but it was written in 2005, that information is going to be a lot different. It's not going to be accurate anymore. And so you need to make sure that you understand those concepts when it comes to evaluating sources. You also need to understand more. There were several questions on it when I took it. When I took the final exam just to see how it was, there were several questions about evaluating and understanding sources. So make sure you really read that chapter well. Now, I want to remind you again, I had started saying this in my last video that I ended up deleting, but this is a test that every time you take it, it changes. So it actually says that it's going to let you take it twice and then save your best score. And so, obviously, if you don't get a good score, you don't get an A the first time around, it would be beneficial to retake it because it will save your higher score. But those questions are going to change every time. So I went through and I looked at the questions that it asked me, but that doesn't mean they're the same questions they're going to ask you. So you really have to go through and study your textbook, okay? Make sure you look at those words in bold and make sure you understand whenever there's like a list of different things, make sure you have a general understanding of it. Even if you don't okay, I don't know whether or not you're going to refer to your textbook. Honestly, I think when it comes to work at home tests, even if you even if it is technically a closed book test, most people do look at their textbook. And so I'm not really going to speak to that one way or the other. But I will say that even if you consult your textbook, if you don't know the material well enough in advance and you're just flipping and flipping and flipping, you're going to run out of time and you're not going to get the test score that you want. So make sure you understand these things well, okay? You need to understand the concept of listening, different types of listening. So there's empathetic and there's critical and comprehensive. Remember, critical is when you're listening to make a decision. Comprehensive is when you're listening to absorb information. Empathetic is when you're listening to a friend and trying to provide support, and appreciative is when you're just listening for enjoyment. You also need to make sure you understand some reasons that people struggle to listen. So, a lot of times we struggle to listen because we are focused on a speaker's appearance or maybe flaws in their delivery, and we get overly focused on that. Right, excuse me. Like you might be trying to listen to this final exam review, but you're like, she's in sweatshirt and her Christmas tree is behind her. And, if you're someone who's easily distracted, that could be a problem. And so you want to make sure that look through this part of the textbook. There's a whole chapter on listening, and you should have a general knowledge of most of those concepts, okay? A lot of times, another thing that we get distracted by is technology and our phones and the prevalence of ads and things going on around us. We try to multitask. We feel pressure to get more done in shorter times. And so make sure that you are understanding why we struggle to listen. I think there were 2 or 3 questions on that when I went through. You need to understand the different speech layouts. Okay, so there's chronological. This is the order in which things happen. So first this happened, and then this happened, and then after that, this happened. So this works really well a lot of times when we consider like people's lives. If I decided I was going to give a speech on Marilyn Monroe to you, I might talk about her early life, her career, and her death. Okay, that's a natural progression of time. If I were going to talk to you about the history of Australia, I would start back here with where we first became aware of Australia and then how time has progressed all the way up until the present. All right, so it's chronological. Then there's spatial. That's when we give a speech according to not when things happened, but where things happened. Okay, so if you're giving a speech about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you might talk about how he spoke in the North at a lot of universities, and then how he led the big march in Washington, D.C., and then how he did a lot of peaceful protesting in the South, and he was actually trampled and arrested and jailed and whatnot in the South. And so if you're going to talk about these different elements of your speech, you might want to classify them according to where they happened, and that would be a spatial layout. The next thing you have is a causal layout. Okay, causal. Every semester I have students who call it a casual layout. It's causal. Okay, a causal layout is where, okay, I'm not encouraging you to watch this movie. It's actually really bad. But there's a movie, The Hangover, that came out a little over a decade ago. And in that movie, these guys wake up, and the very beginning of the movie, they're in a hotel room. One guy has a black eye. There's a tiger in the room. There's a baby in the room, which is never a good mix. Everything is a mess. Like, all this crazy stuff has happened, and they can't remember any of it. And so the whole movie, they're backtracking to figure out what caused this craziness at the beginning of the movie. And so that's the idea of causal layout. Okay, that's where you have something that happens, and then everybody's backtracking or you're backtracking to figure out what led to this point. So if you wanted to talk about there was a major shift in culture and racial relations in the 1960s, then you could backtrack and talk about the work of Dr. King leading up to that point. Okay. The next one is problem solution. This usually works better for persuasive speeches, but you can use it in informative speeches in some contexts. So this is just where you talk about a problem that is happening or did happen, and then the solution to solving the problem. So if the problem is global warming, the solution is reducing greenhouse gases. And then the last one is topical. And topical is where you would talk about different topics related to your subject, but you don't have to put them in any specific order. Like, they don't have to be structured chronologically or spatially. They kind of all stand alone on their own. So there's several questions about that. Make sure you understand those 5 different layouts: chronological, spatial, causal, problem solution, and topical. You need to understand the definition of an extemporaneous speech, and that is where you really do a lot of planning and preparation ahead of time, and then you use a brief set of notes during your speech so that you can speak casually, but you're very prepared and very knowledgeable on your subject. It's not the same as speaking off the top of your head, and it's also not the same as having a highly formalized kind of speech where every single word is memorized. Pre-planned, well prepared, but you work off a brief set of notes, okay? So remember that a central idea needs to be a full sentence. It should not be a question, and it should include your main points. Make sure you understand the idea of using your language well, okay? So using creative language, metaphors, similes, parallelism, repetition, things that we use to make our language really come alive and stand out to our audience. We've all had those really, really boring speakers and teachers who just kind of verbally just throw information out there, and they really don't care if it sticks or not, right? Good, powerful speakers use creative language. And that's where Dr. King was excellent at using creative language to get the point across. Malala, the girl who's referenced in the beginning of our textbook, who was shot in the face by the Taliban for attending school, her Nobel Peace Prize, amazing. She talks about things with all of this poise and elegance, and she uses creative language to get her opinions across. There are a lot of Winston Churchill, another excellent example. And so there's a lot of examples of really powerful speakers who use creative language. So make sure you understand different types of creative language and how to use them. All right, understand what should be in an introduction and also what should be in a conclusion. So, in an introduction, you're going to catch your audience's attention. You're going to unveil your topic clearly. You're going to build your credibility, telling your audience why they should trust you, and also building common ground with your audience. And then you're going to preview your main points by saying, today, I'm going to talk to you about A, B, and C. Okay? In your conclusion, you're going to signal that you're coming to a close, usually by saying, in conclusion, and then you're going to review your main points. So today I've talked to you about, and you mention your main points again, the big takeaways from your speech, and then you have a strong intentional closing statement. Okay? So make sure that you understand what should be included in both of those. You need to understand the idea of outlining. I was kind of surprised they asked about this because these are kind of technical questions, and I think they're hard a little bit to take out of context when you're not writing an outline, but they'll actually ask you about if you have these 5 different points. Some of these would be main points, and some of these would be sub points, and some of them would be sub points. Which one would be a sub point? Like, it was challenging. And so I would make sure that you really look through the textbook, look at the example outlines that we have, and really understand what it means to write this outline the way that the book is telling you to write it. All right, let's see. You need to understand technicalities of speaking, like articulation, that's where you make sure that you pronounce each part of the word the way it's supposed to be pronounced, so you're pronouncing things correctly. And also your intonation, right? So we're making sure that we are using vocal variants, that we're changing our pitch and our tone. Again, you've all probably heard speakers who've come up and said, "Hi, my name is Shelly, and today I'm going to talk to you about recycling. Recycling is very important." That's not effective. You want to use intonation. You want to change up the way that you're speaking, okay? You want to understand different types of graphs and when to use them. So, like a pie chart graph, a bar graph, things like that that are referenced in the textbook and talked about in terms of visual aids. You also want to understand the concept of visual aids in general. So, you want to display a visual aid while you're talking about it, but not the whole time. You don't want to pass something small around the class as a visual aid, and that's not just because of coronavirus. That's generally something you want to avoid anyway. It does detract attention from your speech. You want to make sure you have clean, simple visual aids. Opt for visuals like pictures instead of a lot of words. Remember that people get bored and lazy. We don't want to read a lot of words on your PowerPoint. And so you want to make sure that you have clean, simple visual aids that are going to appeal to your audience and also illustrate the points that you're trying to make. You need to understand different types of logical fallacies. So, an ad hominem is when you attack a person based on their character and ignore the logic of what they're saying. So, even if a bad politician makes a comment that you don't like, they might make a really good comment. They might use sound logic, but you would be quick to go, "Oh, are we really going to listen to someone who's done A, B, and C?" And so that's a type of logical fallacy. There's the slippery slope fallacy. There's the bandwagon fallacy. There's a lot of different fallacies that are labeled in the book. So make sure you have a solid understanding of logical fallacies. We also are going to look at small group needs on the final exam. And so that's going to include the task needs. Remember, that's the person who keeps everyone on task. Like, "Hey guys, glad you're getting along so well, but here's the rubric, and let's make sure that we're checking all these boxes and staying on point." There's the maintenance needs of the group, and that's the emotional maintenance needs of the group, where you're saying, you have that person in the group that brings snacks. A lot of time they're the group parent. They care about making jokes, making everyone feel welcome. And so they're really looking out for the emotional needs of the group. And then you have the people who are doing more of the housekeeping needs, which is making sure there's enough pencils, that the room is reserved, that there's enough chairs, that the heat is on, things like that that are important so that everybody has a chance to study the way they need to or work the way that they need to. All right, let's see here. This was a question that threw me off. I know what brainstorming is, but the definition here was just odd. And so I just want to give you this one. Brainstorming is the free association of words and ideas. So I think the question actually asks you, what is the free association of words and ideas? And the answer is brainstorming. Another question that threw me off on there was it said that people like hearing speeches that are meaningful to them. And the answer to that question is that it is egocentric for people to feel that way. Now, I thought that was a little odd because egocentric has very negative connotations, and I don't really think there's anything negative about wanting to listen to a speech that's meaningful to you. So that's why I'm telling you that, because I checked the wrong thing. So make sure that you keep that in mind. You never cite an abstract when you are citing an article or something from a scholarly journal or an academic journal. You always want to download and read the article, even if it's old, even if it's hard to find. You want to make sure you're citing the article itself. Oh, excuse me. And not just the abstract. And an abstract is something that someone other than the author writes that basically summarizes what is in the work. Now, the last thing I'm going to do here is actually go back in again, and I'm going to go through like a student view and try to retake the final exam so I can see if any other questions pop up that I can try to speak to you about. So give me 1 second here. And if you're not sure where the final exam is, it's under the quizzes tab, okay? Remember that that'll be available for a couple days, so you want to make sure you log on and take that. Okay. Remember that positive visualization is better than, I'm sorry, is a good way to deal with your speech anxiety. Okay, so tell yourself you're going to do well. Visualize yourself doing well during your speech. You can also choose a topic that you care about, that you're interested in, and that should help you with your speech anxiety too. Okay, you should know the parts of the communication model. So you have the speaker and the listener, who a lot of times are both labeled as communicators. And then you've got the channel that goes across the middle of the communication model. And that is the method with which communication is sent. So is it face to face? Is it over the phone? Is it through a text message? Is it through Instagram? How is information disseminated? That is the channel. And then you've got the message that goes over the top and the feedback that comes back to the speaker. And the feedback is showing the speaker how the information is being interpreted and received. And then the situation is kind of the box that goes around the whole thing. So that's where you are, the environment that you're in. And then interference cuts across the middle of that whole entire process. And there's internal interference, the things that are happening inside of you that are keeping you from paying attention and processing information the way that you should. And then there's external interference, which is anything that's happening in your environment that could be distracting to you. So keep those things in mind because you're going to need to know those as well. Okay. So understand how to avoid plagiarism. Really make sure you understand the ethics of speaking. Um, Again, causes of poor listening, the idea of a keyword outline and a presentation outline, how to be a good listener and take notes. That's going to be something that you should know. And again, you might not need to know every single one of these for your test, but I'm just telling you things that I'm seeing when I'm going through the test twice here. All right, make sure that you skim through that chapter on giving your first speech and understanding ways to make your speech successful, interesting, dramatic, things like that. Remember that you don't want to memorize your entire speech word for word. I know that sounds like a good idea, but it does not lend itself to extemporaneous speaking, which I believe is the most effective kind of speaking. It's the one that you're going to use the most in real life, and it's also the one that we're covering in this class. You want to understand the idea of figurative language and trying to avoid figurative language. You want to understand denotative and connotative language and the differences between those. Again, you're going to want to understand different types of questions that you could ask an audience to gain a better understanding of them. So that's part of audience analysis. I'm just trying to look and see what else I haven't covered. It's past midnight now, so my eyes are starting to cross. But let's see here. There's a couple questions about interviews. When you interview someone to find out information about your primary topic. Okay, so interviews are a valid form of, are a valid source that you can cite. It asks questions about using examples during your speech. This time around, it actually asks 3 questions about that. It's going to give you several main points and ask you what organizational pattern they're in. That's those different ones that I mentioned, the chronological, spatial, causal, topical, problem, solution. Almost done, guys. Outlining again. Make sure you have a good concept of outlining. Delivery cues. So you do want to understand nonverbals, eye contact, hand gestures, movements, facial expressions. Those are all really important things to understand. Mm, Almost there. They have questions about whether the purpose statement of your speech addresses policy or a concept or a process, things like that. That's all in the textbook, so make sure you have an understanding of that. Sorry, I'm not going through each thing individually, but my goal is to help you guys understand what you need to study. A little bit about Monroe's motivated sequence. I haven't seen a lot on that, but it was just mentioned in a question. Understand the idea of deductive and inductive reasoning and other types of logic and reasoning. Understand basic concepts of commemorative speaking. So there's speeches of presentation, speeches of acceptance, commemorative speeches, speeches of introduction, things like that. You want to understand a few concepts about each one of those, the different types and what differentiates them, things like that. Okay. And then there's different needs that are in small group that are discussed. And then finally, it talks about group decision making. And you really do want to, as a group, try to make decisions um, together that everyone's pretty happy with instead of like two or three people voting and then not caring about what the other person says. You should make every effort to reach a consensus before you decide to go for like a majority vote. Okay. So again, I'm not promising you exactly what's going to be on the exam because it does change every time. But as long as you've been reading your textbook, you should be fine. Just go back over it with a highlighter. Really try to highlight the things that I mentioned, specifically study those, but also look through the rest of the textbook. This is just meant to be help. This is not comprehensive. So please don't email me and get upset with me if you say this was not on the final exam review. There might be things that were not here on this final exam review, and it's really just a review of your textbook knowledge and what the textbook has to say. So be prepared going into it, but remember, you do get a second try, but the questions will change, so you just have to do your very best, okay? We made it 30 minutes, and my baby didn't wake up. Hopefully, that's not the longest stretch that she'll sleep tonight. I hope you guys get some sleep. Hang in there. You guys are doing a great job. Have a great day tomorrow, and I am looking forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.